Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So I want to talk to you today about, well, not just Socrates, but most philosophers, historically speaking, their views on democracy, which, contrary to popular opinion, they have not held, their views on democracy have not been overwhelmingly positive. And at first blush, you might think to yourself, well, why on earth would philosophers hate democracy? I mean, after all, this is nothing more than the system of political governance, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, in Book 6 of the Republic, Plato's famous book, The Republic, which is a meditation on an ideal society, Socrates is having a conversation with an interlocutor named Adeimantus. And Socrates asked Adeimantus, if you were heading out to sea, who would you want to be steering the ship? Who would you want to be captain of the ship? Anybody? Anybody at all? Just some random person, or someone who is knowledgeable in the ways of seafaring? The answer is obvious. Someone who is knowledgeable in the ways of seafaring. If you had to get your appendix out, would you just want any old person to cut it out, or would you want to go to a skilled surgeon? Right? If you had to have your transmission rebuilt, obviously not just anybody can do that. You need a skilled mechanic. So the point is, right, why then would we entrust the governance of the nation to people who typically have no idea what good political governance is? And Socrates is well aware of the dangers of what would happen if people voted with their emotions instead of their reason. After all, Socrates, we know well, he lost his life because of this, right? The vote to execute him was 52% to 48%, right? So by a somewhat close margin, right? He was executed. Now that having been said, it's not as though Socrates thinks that democracy is just bad on the face of it per se. The problem is when people, the problem with democracy occurs when people vote with their emotions rather than their reason. So it is incumbent, it is a duty that is inherent upon the average citizen to be as educated about matters as they possibly can be. Now, that having been said, being an absolute expert on international relations and which leader will best advance the interests of the United States, and respect human, that's a tall order for your average citizen. But then people can read their voter guides that are in California, for example. Everyone gets a voter guide every single election that gives you a pro and a con, two opposing arguments on each side of an issue, right? It behooves us to do that, and it also behooves us to not be like those who responded to a September 2000 poll. I remember this vividly at the time. George W. Bush was running for the Republicans. Al Gore was running for the Democrats. There was a survey, a famous survey that was distributed. Which of the two candidates would you rather have a beer, right? And everyone overwhelmingly said George W. Bush. That is an absolutely terrible criterion for choosing a leader. And I'm sure a lot of people voted along those same lines, right? This is what concerned a later philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, in the 17th century. He hated democracy because he thought democracy was apt to become what he called a dictatorship of the orators, right? And this is something that Socrates expressed a great deal of concern about too. Democracy plays into the hands of demagogues. What's a demagogue? A demagogue is a rhetorician. A rhetorician is someone who's skilled in the emotional use of language. And a demagogue is a rhetorician who uses the emotional aspects of language to instill hatred, fear, xenophobia, and various other negative qualities that they can then use to manipulate and control the populace and bring about an authoritarian government. So this is something that David Hume in the 18th century warned about. The best form of government is that form of government which allows for the maximum amount of political liberty for its citizens. That's indisputable. But the irony is those forms of governments, representative democracies, etc., nations that allow for a high degree of free speech and political liberty, they sow the seeds of their own destruction because they must allow those elements in society, religious fanatics, political extremists, powerful moneyed interests, their freedom of speech. And those three groups, will use their freedom of speech to bring down that democracy itself and install an authoritarian government. So, what then is the best bulwark? What's the best safety against a tyranny? Well, again, as Socrates has pointed out, you simply, if you're going to be a voter, you're going to participate in democracy, you've got an incumbent responsibility. Be as educated about the issues and the candidates as is possible. How do you do this? Well, don't fall into the trap of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a well documented cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a tendency, an unconscious tendency that human beings have that distorts, alters, or disrupts rational belief formation. And confirmation bias is one of the most common of these cognitive biases. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out sources of information that confirm what we are already inclined to believe. As a good critical thinker, your responsibility, your duty, your moral obligation, I would say, is to seek out as many sources of information on an issue, on a candidate, as is humanly possible, and sift those messages through your critical thinking lens.